Right, well, hello. Let's get this thing going. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me here at the Watch Talk stage, where over the course of the next half an hour or so, we're going to be addressing this theme, changing times, the challenges facing an analog industry in a digital world. And we're going to be asking whether the luxury watch industry can get out of its current recession, how traditional luxury watchmakers might win back a disappearing generation of watch buyers and win over a new one, and indeed whether or not they want to. I'm going to throw out a few ideas and theories, and at the end I'll leave some time for some questions, and we'll see where that gets us to. Right, I just used the word recession, the big, nasty R word. Economists get very overexcited about it, politicians flee from it, and as citizens of the world, there's often very little that we can do about it. But what does recession actually mean to watchmakers and to the luxury watch industry? And indeed, is it even fair to say that a market that's now worth, in primary sales, around $50 billion is actually in one? Well, let's go back in time briefly. So over the past 3 or 4 decades, perhaps, luxury watchmaking has undergone this very significant transformation. Once it was a mainstream industry, producing around 100 million watches a year for the everyman as well as for the elite. But today it's morphed into this niche industry, offering a product that is no longer something that people need, but something that people want. Now, I won't need to explain to any of you, I suspect, how outmoded mechanical analog watchmaking is in a digital and hyper-connected world, nor I suspect how beautiful it is and how much we admire it. But I will outline my view today that the luxury watch industry is fueled by this explosive cocktail of nostalgia, desire, and status that is all but entirely dependent on the end consumer's emotions rather than the practicalities of their everyday reality. Mechanical watches are unnecessary, but for all their most ephemeral qualities, and no one these days is pretending otherwise, so far as I've been able to see. And so for around 3 decades, this nostalgia, desire, status cocktail has proved enormously popular and therefore enormously successful. Brand after brand has dragged itself up out of the ashes of the quartz crisis with stories of archived designs, this blend of innovation and hand craftsmanship, and marketing campaigns and retail experiences, of course, that have made us feel like what the brands are offering is going to make us feel better about ourselves. It's going to make us feel more stylish and more employable and more confident and perhaps even better looking, more loved even. And up until about 2015, this strategy was yielding fabulous rewards. The Swiss watch industry's volumes hovered around 20 to 30 million, 25 to 30 million, let's say, a year. Revenues were climbing rapidly, pushing through the advent of the smartphone and, of course, the not insignificant challenges of the financial crisis. So by 2015, we have luxury watches, which are, many of them are nostalgic designs, and they are firmly established as objects of desire and status. I don't like to talk in generalizations, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of people knew what a moon watch was, a lot of people knew that Hublot loved football, and a lot of people could have a go at Patek's famous strapline. But then things started to change. Indeed, we saw a new generation of consumers beginning to emerge. And these weren't just digitally savvy consumers. They were, of course, digital natives. Those who couldn't remember a time without the internet, without being connected all the time. And they found that they had suddenly had 101 expensive and often very clever products and experiences to spend their money on, many of them substitutes for a mechanical watch. And so since 2015, which as we know was the year when the Apple Watch landed on high streets across the globe, the Swiss watch industry has moved into this new paradigm, not of its own volition, with new market conditions and new and very powerful competition. Switzerland exported 500,000 fewer watches in 2015 than it had done the year before, beginning a slide that the industry has been doing its best to mask ever since. So how bad is this slide? Well, last year, according to the Federation of the Swiss Watch Industry, which I shall call the FHS from now on, the Swiss watch companies exported 15.3 million watches, which the FHS described as an historic low. To neither the quartz crisis, nor the financial crisis, nor even the effects of a global pandemic brought volumes so low. And let's not forget that this figure of 15.3 million watches exported by Switzerland includes one of the hottest watches of the 21st century, the all-conquering Moonswatch, launched 3 years ago, and which is now thought to account for around 1 to 2 million watches a year of those exports, of course. Now, if you take out Moonswatch from those exports, that historic low would perhaps dip to around 13.5 million watches exported a year. That means the watch exports by volume have crumbled, more than halving in a decade. Now, what does this mean, and should this be classed as a recession? Well, I suspect that depends on whether you read the mask or the face behind it. So on the one hand, the industry has adapted very quickly to this new paradigm, pushing prices up, protecting profits, keeping shareholders happy in the main, and maintaining this appearance of growth. In a roundabout way, of course, we know that rising prices and profits have been amped up by the stubbornly resilient Swiss franc and the soaring price of gold, which I suspect many of you will know is currently setting record highs on an almost daily basis as it reaches $3,000 an ounce. But even those allowances, average watch prices are now considerably higher than they were a decade ago. To illustrate this trend, let's take as our example exports of watches made from precious metals. Now, last year, these increased 2.2% by value, according to the FHS. But then at the same time, volumes of those watches decreased by 5.1%. Fewer watches, higher sales. But if we look further down the value spectrum, and we find exports of watches at lower values are shelling values as well as volumes. It's a bit of a bloodbath down there. But I would say that rising exports have been masking the industry's chronic recession for years, until last year when we saw the value bubble burst. After consecutive years of record years prompted by the pandemic luxury boom, last year the value of Swiss watch exports actually declined for the first time in years, excluding, of course, the blip year of 2020. The value of exports last year was 26 billion Swiss francs, which was down 2.8%, but volumes were down 9.4%, equivalent to 1.6 million watches. So the face behind the mask of luxury watchmaking will be no happier on reading the FHS's forecast for 2025. The continuing decline of the Chinese and Hong Kong markets, both leading sectors at various times over the last 20 years, shows no signs of easing, and the FHS has been left with the uncomfortable conclusion that Swiss watch exports are therefore likely to continue on last year's downward trend. But perhaps more tellingly, speaking with experts, in fact, a conversation that I had with one of you even just 2 minutes ago before I got up here, I learned that the FHS's version of events is just the tip of the iceberg. Reduced working hours, fewer production shifts, they're now commonplace across Swiss factories, many of which are under a huge amount of pressure. Retailers are reducing orders as inventories swell and safe stores overflow. I'm conscious this is getting a little bit gloomy. In fact, I'm surprised any of you are still here. But if those are the facts, I think a number of questions remain for us to answer. First, why has this happened? Second, is there anything we can do about it? And third, what might actually happen next? Well, let's start with the why. I mean, inevitably, theories abound. Briefly, they tend to fall into one of two categories, those that are the industry's fault and those that aren't. So we'll come to the industry's failings in a moment, but before we kick it while it's down, let's give it a break and recognize that very challenging, if not unstable, global political, economic, and social climate has done it no favors. We've mentioned the price of gold, we've mentioned the value of the Swiss franc and China, where stalling growth and the collapse of the housing market has put a massive dent in consumer finances. But of course, we could also mention wars, we could mention the financial market sent into a spin by unstable election results, particularly relevant today, environmental issues, the challenges of operating sustainable businesses, the cost of living crisis, and, of course, the rise of the smartwatch. These are all bad actors beyond the industry's control. And so we could fairly say, bad luck, not your fault, do the best you can. But the fact is that despite all these problems, the industry hasn't done itself many favors in the meantime. If it's at fault, I would say it's because it hasn't done a good enough job of maintaining relevance, offering these products at prices consumers can afford, or sustaining consistent levels of desirability and even status. I mean, think about it. If 5 or 10 or even 20, certainly 20 years ago, consumers were drawn to luxury watches because they offered these nostalgic designs, because they offered desire, because they offered status, as per the cocktail I've described, have these consumers somehow now changed? Are we no longer motivated by great designs of the past and by the promise of product design and mechanical longevity? Are we no longer motivated to spend our hard-earned money on those things that serve as outward symbols of our achievements and how we feel about ourselves? Well, I'd say, of course not. So why aren't people buying what luxury watchmakers have to offer in the volumes they once were? Well, let's use today's younger consumers, the Gen Zers, as our lens. Gen Zers are no doubt different to generations that went before them, but I'd argue they have the same basic impulses and desires as any other generation. Only now, of course, they get to make their decisions with a vast amount of more information and much more choice. Some of you will know Austin Chu. Austin is the founder of the Hong Kong-based online watch trading and community platform WristCheck. I interviewed him for a piece in the Financial Times towards the end of last year about how Gen Z are interacting with watches. And he said this. He said, Gen Z are the smartest consumers by far because they're the first generation growing up with a smartphone. Previous generations, he said, only had access to their local market, whereas they've had access to the world. And of course, the world offers far more than the local jeweler ever did. You see, I'd argue the difference now compared to even 10 years ago is that it's not education, it's not the connected world, it's not social media, it's not even the perils of the so-called attention economy. And I'd say the big difference can be described in one word: competition. And that competition is defined not only by the type of product or even how that product is accessed, but by how it's presented, and of course, by how the consumer perceives it. I interviewed Scarlett Baker for the same piece in the FT. Scarlett is another Gen Zer. She's a colleague of mine, a fellow journalist. And she made this point. She said, "We are the ultimate detectors of fakery. We're a generation that needs to know the story behind a product, and we're very curious. So we'll put the research in if we want it. And we're the harshest critics. We're the first people to call someone out when the values don't line up. So don't lie to us." Has the watch industry been lying to us? Well, I think it's a harder thing to stand up here and say, and I'm not going to fall on one side of the fence or the other. But I think the point is that today's consumers, and not only Gen Zers, are much more naturally suspicious than they were before. That greatly increases competition for our attention, for our affections, and of course for our wallets. They might ask, where's the value in a watch? Why has the price gone up so much? Is it really as accurate and as reliable as you tell me it is? Oh, and what about that recycled steel you're selling me? We all do it, not just Gen Zers. We all want to know, and we're all making the same demands of the brands, amplifying the competition. But, and thank goodness there's a but, because there has to be some good news, and I hope I've found some. It's a bit of an extreme example, but it brings us to our second question. Is there anything that can be done about what's happening in the industry at the moment, about this recession? Well, the industry may be in recession, by my definition, but I think that there are brands that are not. Brands that have grown their businesses by alloying nostalgia and desire and status together in products that appear to be passing the tests laid down by Austin and Scarlett, my two Gen Zers. Now, naming names is the only right course of action at this point, and sort of a combination of my understanding of the statistics and my gut feeling brings me, at this point, to Tag Heuer. Tag Heuer, as you will probably know, has just been named as the official timekeeper of Formula One. Magnificent deal for the company, which of course has incredible heritage and therefore a lot of nostalgia, lots of ties to the sport, so that's our nostalgia box ticked. And it's going into the sport at a time when audience and fan figures are accelerating fast, both geographically and demographically. According to Nielsen Sports, 41% of the world's 1.5 billion Formula One viewers this year will be women. So that, in a way, is at least a pencil mark in the desire and status boxes. Now, news of this partnership began circulating last October after LVMH, Tag Heuer's parent company, signed a deal with F1's owners, Liberty Media, to become the official timekeeper. Of course, sorry, that wasn't announced in October last year. That was announced in January this year. But this 10-year deal appears to have had a significant impact on Tag Heuer's profile, which has been trending up ever since. Chief Executive Antoine Pin told me last week that in January, footfall into Tag Heuer stores was up by double digits. And then I spoke to the Digital Luxury Group, a Geneva-based digital marketing agency, and asked them to gather some independent data for me on how Tag Heuer is performing on social media, and it appears it's killing it there as well. It's relegated Tudor and Breitling and Longines et al. Into a distant second place on all the key engagement metrics. Tag Heuer itself says that in January, in fact, it was the #1 watch brand in terms of engagement on Instagram, ahead of Rolex, ahead of Omega, ahead of everyone. But I offer that as testimony rather than fact, as I've not been able to prove it. But has it had an impact on sales? Well, of course, it's too early to say what impact it's had on sales, bearing in mind the partnership was only announced 6 weeks ago, but news of it and suspicions of it were obviously there in October last year. But it appears that Tag Heuer is on the up. Morgan Stanley's highly influential annual Swiss report came out only last week, and it showed Tag Heuer's revenues were up by 9% in 2024. That makes it one of only a handful of brands that have increased their sales over the past 12 months. Now, it won't surprise you to hear that Rolex and Cartier and Audemars Piguet also grew last year, according to Morgan Stanley, although none by a comparable percentage. Arguably, of course, they were starting from a larger base, and it's harder to grow by the same percentage when you start from a larger base. But what are we saying here? Will Formula One move the needle for Tag Heuer? I certainly think it has the potential to. Obviously, in terms of awareness, I don't think anybody's going to dispute that. But in terms of sales, I think it will only have a positive impact if Tag Heuer adds lines to its collection that its audience, can afford as well as aspire to. Now, at the moment, there's no sign that that's happening. LVMH Watch Week brought us some watches at around the sort of $5,000 price point. But I'd be very surprised if at Watches and Wonders in a few weeks' time we don't see a product paradigm shift that better aligns Tag Heuer to this audience and that will turbocharge the brand's volumes as well as its revenues. Now, of course, not every brand can afford to become Formula One's official timekeeper, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that it should or that it would be possible. But I think, oh goodness, we're talking in the region of $60 to $70 million for the rights to be on TV screens this year. But if a brand takes this resigned response to the challenge that the example of Tag Heuer offers, I can't honestly see how they're going to win. It was Henry Ford who said that the man who stops advertising to save money is like the man who stops the clock to save time. But I single Tag Heuer and its Formula One partnership out, not just to illustrate how nostalgia, desire, and status can be used to amplify and improve a brand's fortunes, but for another reason too. And that's because I think it has the potential to arrest the industry's volume problem, or at least contribute to it, to be part of a solution. By what factor I couldn't say, but having spoken to Monsieur Pin just last week, he is ambitious for volumes as well as for values, which makes him almost unique among some of the larger watch brand CEOs in an industry that has shown itself very happy to shrink volumes and hike prices. And we should note, as I suspect you'll know, that volumes really do matter. While as far as most consumers outside this building will probably assume that watch brands are independent and self-sufficient and make all their own stuff, most here will, I suspect, know that, of course, the opposite is true. Luxury watchmaking is a complex industrial matrix where even the biggest of brands rely on suppliers for parts and expertise. For now, it's the volume brands that keep this supply chain healthy. If their volumes slump much further, these suppliers will be under even greater pressure, and they may even collapse, in turn taking with them dozens of brands that produce nothing of their own at all. Movement suppliers, case and dial makers, the guys who make the hands, the sapphire glasses, the gaskets, the buckles, all of it. Where would the smaller independents whose USP is tied only to their creativity be without the might of an industry behind them? The trouble is, to get a bit gloomy again, is that bar Tag Heuer, there don't seem to be many of the big players, many others of those big brands, who have much appetite to reverse this shrinking volumes trend. And to me, that means that the brands today are asking the wrong question. At the moment, the question seems to be, why should we make watches that no one's going to buy? When the question should be, why does no one want to buy the watches that we're making? At the moment, the solution seems to be that if you can't sell one watch at $3,000, sorry, 10 watches at $3,000, then you try and sell one at $30,000. Of course, you get a nice big profit margin from that, but it's a short-term fix to a long-term problem. So what is the long term? That brings us to our final question of what happens next. Where is this all going? Some of you may know Oliver Muller, who's a great colleague of mine and one of the authors of Morgan Stanley's report, and he said to me last week that over the next few years he can see volumes declining further still to around 12 million units exported a year. Now, I consider Oliver something of a horological oracle because everything that he said, everything he's predicted over the past few years appears to have come to pass. I don't know about you, but if he is right again, I'm not going to be hugely happy about it, because I want to see this analog mechanical industry survive and thrive in a digital age and to offer watches people want and that they can reasonably afford and that they can own, more importantly. Because I think in a way we never really own a storyless smartwatch or smartphone, because at some point we'll trade them in. We know this. They're never really ours. They never really tell our story. There's something in a watch which does more. When I came into the industry a little over 20 years ago, as a young man looking to make his way in the world, I could reasonably imagine being able to afford a Speedmaster or a Carrera. In fact, the first magazine that I edited in this space in 2004 listed a Moon watch at £1,300. Today, the same watch, or at least the equivalent watch, is £6,600. That's 5 times more. Now, salaries aren't 5 times higher, certainly not in the UK where I'm from, than they were 20 years ago, and goodness knows disposable income certainly isn't. So how can Omega expect to sell as many watches as it did back then? Well, of course it doesn't. And many will argue that's okay, because that's the nature of modern luxury, that's the cost of the luxurification of watchmaking. People want what they can't have, after all. But my concern, my fear, is that that makes this industry smaller. It makes it more inward-looking. It means fewer people will have access to these mechanical watches and to the great dial names behind them. It means watches become for the few and not the many, and probably the same few who already have life's luxuries. I wonder if what we're seeing is the sort of slow death of a watchmaking democracy and the creation of an exclusive new watch world order dictated by a very small cohort of brands and their consumers. Some of them will probably like that, but I'm not sure I can say hand on heart that I do. But call me naive, call me blindly optimistic. I do think it's still possible to reverse this trend, but only if the industry and the brands in it that shape it, only if they really genuinely want it, do they want to reverse this trend. Thanks very much for joining me. Nice to see you all.